welcome to another Scots Whay Hae podcast. And today I'm joined by crime writer Christopher Brookmyre to talk about his latest novel, The Cracked Mirror, and more. Hello, Chris.
Good morning. Hello.
So, I say we'll talk about more, but there's so much to discuss about The Cracked Mirror. It's unlike any crime novel I've read. I'm also, as I mentioned to you before we started, never been more worried about spoilers. So I'm going to ask you to describe it, to give me a kind of steer on what we can discuss and what we can't. How do you describe it to people?
My elevator pitch is always to say it's asking what would happen if Miss Marple and Harry Bosch had to work together. So it sort of takes an archetype, really, a detective from each end of the crime fiction spectrum, really. It takes character of Penny Coyne, who is a retired librarian, volunteer librarian in her 80s, living in a wee Perthshire village called Glencluther. And it's a very well-to-do, picturesque wee village, apart from all the murders. There's a lot of murders in this little village, all of which get solved by Penny. So she is the sort of archetypal amateur sleuth, whose murders tend to be not terribly bloody and gory, and the motives usually involve a disputed inheritance or a love triangle at the high end of society, all that kind of thing. And then she gets a wedding invitation, which she's pleased about because it's at a lovely hotel in Perthshire, but she's a wee bit concerned because she doesn't recognise the names of anyone on the invitation, which she thinks, well, that's intriguing, but she's also the big problem is she's losing her memory. And so she's concerned that it's just that she can't remember who's invited her. So meanwhile, and this is when readers will think that they've encountered a binding error when they read the book. After 3 chapters of that, you find yourself in Los Angeles in the company of Johnny Hawk, Lieutenant Johnny Hawk, who's your classic LAPD homicide maverick detective, always in trouble with his captain, always breaking in a new partner because his partners tend to go the way of Spinal Tap drummers. So he's the kind of guy he enforces the law, but he's not so sure about the rules. He thinks sometimes the rules are there to protect the rich and powerful from the law. And he's asked to investigate a suicide, an apparent suicide, at a movie studio. The head of the studio is very connected politically, so he's told, investigate this thoroughly, professionally, but discreetly. And he manages 2 out of 3, gets himself suspended, but he's convinced it's not a suicide. And he's got one lead, which is an invitation to a wedding in Perthshire. So these 2 detectives from very different worlds, very different types of crime fiction, suddenly have their paths cross. And of course, they're going to end up having to team up.
The great thing about that description is it really will leave people wanting to know more and more questions than answers. Before we get into it in any other detail, how did it come about that you were going to write this unusual, to say the least, novel?
The beginning of it was simply my editor tweeted something. You're never sure what tiny little kernel will cause your imagination to fire. My editor tweeted that he'd like to read or publish a book that was a meta murder mystery. And that kind of made me interested because I'm always quite keen on things that play with the conventions and tropes in a genre. I'm a big fan of The Cabin in the Woods, for instance. Mm-hmm. And I think that made me think, well, I like the opportunity to play with these things. But I was slightly wary because for me, the downside of something meta is it can often be so up itself that it's something that's deconstructing everything so much that it forgets to construct real characters, or and also sometimes it can be a wee bit sneery, something meta, as if it's deconstructing something to show how stupid it is. So I wasn't so sure, and then I suddenly had this image popped out in my head of St Mary Mead, Miss Marple's village, mm-hmm. and a SWAT team descending on it in full Kevlar body armour and machine guns, and a gun battle taking place. And I just had this image of that and thought, that never happens. These 2 ends of the crime genre never clash. So what would happen if they did? And how could I make that happen? You know, what scenario would allow that to happen? So it took months and months really to come up with these two characters, and more importantly, come up with a scenario that would allow their paths to cross. And also, it had to be something very intriguing, because you get essentially you're going to be writing with these two people who are supposed to be great detectives in their own right, and so you have to give them a challenge unlike anything they've had before. So yeah, it kind of came from that. It came from a desire to write something quite meta, but also something very emotionally compelling. I remember saying to my editor, it's not enough that I can tell a story or play games with the genre here. My job here is to make the reader cry.
Yeah, and as we get to the kind of ending, all sorts of emotions are coming out. I can't remember. Do you ever give it a time? Is there ever like you know, like 1980s, 1990s, present day?
I think it is largely just set in the present day, with obviously it has to be the present day because a certain amount of time has passed since some of the events that they are investigating, from the murder or another apparent suicide that dates from 20 odd years before.
Yeah. No, the reason I ask that is because, you know, these worlds that you're talking about, in my head anyway, are kind of decades apart. But actually, Perthshire that you're writing about, you know, whether it's a real one or an imagined one, is very much different to LA contemporary time-wise. You know, they were, of course, they're as wide apart as they would be over a century or so.
Well, in a way, I thought about the fact that the Miss Marple stories, you know, it's the 1930s, 1940s, etc., and even the kind of cozy end of the genre sometimes can feel like it's the 50s, or you know, a very mythologized genteel time.
Yeah.
So that's why it's got an idealized version of a Perthshire village, and at the same time, the LA side of it was meant to seem more contemporary, but it's in equally the quintessential LA of Johnny Hawk would be like 80s and 90s kind of action cinema. So, I mean, I wondered at one point, how do you do this if almost like it would be like two completely different times? But I didn't write something that involved time travel. We know, I mean, the fun as that would have been to have a sort of 90s LA cop end up in 1940s or 1950s Perthshire, but I didn't want to go down that route.
That's adding in just another challenge to you, I think, to get through that. And I mean, you're writing them both very well, because on one hand, I thought I'd maybe visited the village in Perthshire, and it's only when you read on you think, oh no, you couldn't have been at that particular Crathy Hall. And the other one is, I'm sure I could have watched Johnny Hawk on Saturday night on the telly back in the 80s or 90s. You know, it felt like a kind of serialized TV show that, you know, kind of between Starsky and Hutch and you know, whatever else was on at that time. Did you, because when I first started doing that, I did ask, how's he going to pull this off? Because as you say, it's like two books have been squeezed together at the beginning anyway. Were you always confident that this was going to turn out the way you wanted? Did you always know where it was going to go?
Well, I was not confident about it turning out the way I wanted, but I did know where it was going to go. I mean, I spent probably more time planning this book than any book before, and working on the concept, working on the structure, the point at which the paths would cross, where they would go. The fact that I knew from the off it would have to involve Johnny coming to Penny's Perthshire, but about halfway through, it was going to have to flip and have the two of them go back to California, because the key in a mismatched detective story is from when you get characters from different worlds, they have to visit each other's worlds.
Yeah.
So I knew that much, and I knew the overall concept, so it was very well planned out. But as for confident, I mean, I think all the way through this book, certainly about the first 2/3, 3/4, I was very apprehensive, very nervous. I felt a great burden. I kept saying to my wife, look, I'm never writing anything like this again, because it felt very pressured. I think it's because when you've got an idea that you think is a good idea, and there's a lot of scope and a lot of work poured into it, you think, I don't want to drop the ball here, you know. So I was having a lot of fun on a daily basis. Once, if I was writing an individual scene or an individual chapter, and I knew where it was going, I could have a lot of fun being in Johnny's head or describing the world from Penny's perspective, and also when they came together, you know, the friction between them. But overall, I felt like it was a hard book to write, because it was just, it was a question of being aware of how hard it was going to be to pull this off.
You talked about planning there. Do you always plan your novels to some extent?
To some extent, I mean, more so now, in that I've always known what will ultimately be revealed. You know, I won't, you know, you have to know when it's crime fiction. I think you need to know what the crime is, you know, and who's done it and how they've tried to get away with it. I know there's a lot of crime writers, especially who write kind of whodunit novels, that won't know themselves. They'll decide themselves after a while once they've spent time with their detective. But I could never do that. I kind of take my cue from stage magic. You know, the magicians don't take the stage till everything's in place, and I think you need to know what it is you're trying to misdirect the reader from all the way through. But I used to just have I'd know what was going on ultimately, and I'd have an overall concept. I'd have a scenario, and I would just dive into it and see where it took me. And sometimes I'd end up quite lost and have to find some way back to the conclusion. But in recent years, I became more disciplined about planning. By the time of writing things like Black Widow, I had to be very disciplined, because that's a book that has got a huge twist in it, and I had to therefore know all of these elements whilst writing it so that the twist would work. But the big change was writing with my wife, Marisa Haetzman, writing the Ambrose Parry novels. But that required me to plan a lot more, because if you're both writing, you need to both know where it's going, so you can say, well, I'll write that chapter while you write that chapter. So there was a lot of planning involved in that, and that's been revolutionary for me. I mean, Marisa has kind of licked me into shape in terms of how explicit my planning is, and I couldn't have embarked on a novel like this if I hadn't had the experience of working with her, if that hadn't transformed how I work. And we did actually work on this together. We planned it out together. I did all the actual writing, and Marisa did say she was very grateful not to be involved in the execution of this, but she was heavily involved in the sort of conceptual stage and working out the 5-act structure.
I mean, is that important when, as the novel moves on, things are perhaps unexpected in the way that, I mean, it was quite unexpected right from the beginning, but do you know what I mean? Is that part of it? You think, well, how am I going to get to this end? Because the beginning, I think with some novels you can say, there's the beginning and there's the end, and I can see how they got there. With this one, you know, it takes quite a few twists and turns to get there.
Yeah, I had to have a really strong sense of where certain, what we might call tentpole moments would happen, you know, and what that would do to affect the characters at that point as well. So I had to know and change it. It was almost like once I started writing it, you realise, well, actually, this big moment has to come later, or this moment has to come earlier. You know, you start to see that. But I knew what these big moments were, what the big reveal would be, and how it would come about, and where that would fall in the structure. And I say the big reveal, but also there's a big reveal about 2/3, 3/4 of the way in, and then there's that has implications that transform the final 2 acts of the story.
Yeah, what I'll say is, if readers are like me, they will not guess what's coming next, which is actually a big joy to kind of get through. And you've mentioned Marple, and you mentioned the kind of LA hard-boiled crime series or films. Were there other writers or genres in mind when you were writing the book?
I mean, I toyed with what else I could bring into it, but I'd say the main thing, I mean, Harry Bosch is a good point of reference for the sort of hard-boiled end of things, in the same way as Marple's the obvious reference at the cosy end of things. But Johnny Hawk belongs, as I say, as much to 80s and 90s action cinema. And I'd say that overall, the other big influence in the book is Shane Black.
Right.
Because he is just the great exponent of the mismatched detective story. So Lethal Weapon, The Last Boy Scout, Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, and The Nice Guys. They all have this, what's sometimes called a buddy cop story. The idea of buddy cop implies that they're friends, and actually the whole structure, the whole friction relies on them not being friends. It's like two people who've got very different values, different methods of working, but they come to respect each other over the course of the story. And crucially, what I realised in this story was I wanted them to be two people who realise that not only do they come to like each other, they come to recognise that the thing that repelled them from the other person is actually the thing missing from themselves. So that ultimately, in order to solve the mystery, they have to become a bit more like each other. And that's something Shane Black, he's always done that very well, and he's had this great, entertaining, over-the-top action stories that involve these mismatched detectives. I mean, I've sort of drawn on that before when I wrote Places in the Darkness, which is a science fiction crime novel set on a space station. I wanted to write a female buddy cop thriller with two very mismatched women detectives who are just at loggerheads pretty much 3/4 of the novel, until they are forced to work together, but they don't kind of show really any affection to each other towards quite late on. And I'd say that is the other model for this book, as much as it's taken the two poles of crime fiction. I thought the ultimate mismatched detective pair-up would be two people from completely different ends of crime fiction.
That's really interesting. Am I right? I might be wrong about this. Did Shane Black do The Long Kiss Goodnight?
Yeah.
That was funny because that kind of came to mind when I was reading it, because you have the Gina Davis character who's very much domesticated and set in her ways and all that stuff. And then you have, now it works in a very different way, but to begin with, I thought that's a great example of two people from apparently very different kind of areas coming together and working together. And you mentioned the cosy aspect of the Miss Marple stories, and cosy crime in recent years seems to have become a huge thing. And I wondered if that was on your mind at all when you were writing it.
No, I think it was just simply, in the same way as something like The Cabin in the Woods, I love that so much because I love the type of horror movies that it's referencing. And I think what I wanted was to write something that did what that did, which is it's an affectionate way of it's paying tribute to those cliches and those conventions, and celebrating them. And by taking two characters from different ends of things, you actually see all those conventions and tropes almost afresh, because you're seeing them from the eyes of someone who belongs in a different subgenre. So I didn't want to write something where I was making out that, say, that the cosy end of things is a bit silly, and the sort of Harry Bosch end of things is where it should be. It was about celebrating both sides of that. So that's why I decided to kind of pay tribute to the cosy end of things, because I thought in order for this to work, I have to commit as much to both.
Yeah.
I can't have readers come away saying, oh, he was obviously much more comfortable writing about Johnny Hawk than he was writing about Penny Coyne, so I had to absolutely commit to both of those things.
I think that commitment is clear, because perhaps you think, well, there's going to be, as you said right at the beginning, maybe a bit of parody or a bit of not patronizing, but that aspect of it. Oh, you like this? Well, this is what I think about it. But it's absolutely not. They're both really strong examples of the genre.
Yeah, I think what's important is that there's sometimes a sense that people would regard cosy as just pure escapism and therefore less important. And I wanted to point out that the world of Johnny Hawk is no more realistic than the world of Penny Coyne. And in both cases, we love them because they're escapist. And we talk about cosy suggesting comfort, but we take comfort by escaping into the world of action novels and action cinema as well. We go there because it's not real. We go there for the escapism of going to this place where the bad guys will be defeated and the place will make sense in a particular way. So it was important to stress that the whole thing is an escapist novel. I just want people to go into this novel and have a great time. and to remember all the things they love about these two sides of crime fiction.
And going back to the two central characters, Penny and Johnny really come to care about each other. And do you think that's vital for us to care so much about them as we do at the end?
Yeah, I remember, as I said earlier, my job was to try and make the reader cry with this book. I thought often with anything that's quite meta, my concern is that if they deconstruct the character so much, it doesn't feel like a person anymore. And I thought we read crime fiction, both ends of the genre, for those characters, not just for the mystery, you know, and we want to relate to the characters. So I was very adamant that I should create two characters that you would really care about, and that they weren't just going to be some kind of vehicles for deconstructing parts of crime fiction. You know, I wanted to tell very emotional stories because I'm spending months and months in a very intense process with these characters, so I need to care about them, and I think that's what I'm hoping comes out on the page.
How did you approach writing two characters in this way? Did you jump between them as we do in the book, or did you write one story out and then the other?
I tended to write a lot of one at a time. I would write everything that happens before they both end up at the wedding. I wrote all of the Johnny stuff in a big chunk, and then all the Penny stuff, and then edited it together. And then also once they overlap, I would write a whole load from one character's point of view, so that I stayed in their headspace and stayed in that narrative style, and then saw how the narratives overlapped. There was a wee bit of juggling and changing of things so that the timeline matched up, or you know, that I had to. And some then once they came together, it became really complex because you then have to decide: is this a Johnny chapter? Or is this a Penny chapter? Because that doesn't only have implications for whose point of view it is, whose head you're inside, but also what you can actually do with the chapter or how you would tell that story. So there was trade-offs. There was sometimes I think, well, you know what, if this chapter was from Penny's point of view, it would allow me to do that, but it needs to be from Johnny's point of view for some other reason. So there was a lot of trade-offs there.
And there's a really strong sense of place going on in both Scotland and LA. Did the nature of the plot allow you to, because as I said earlier on, I felt I could have visited that part of Perthshire, and LA was recognisable through film and TV, and even having been there many years ago. But they are fictional. I mean, it's important that they're fictional, isn't it?
They're both self-consciously fictionalized versions.
Yeah.
It's not a real Perthshire village. It's not me joking about what Perthshire's like, although there are jokes in there about Perth and Fife. But there's the LA is just as fictional as the Perthshire village is, and I think it was again to emphasise that these are places we escape to. These are realms of the imagination. They're the imaginary versions of these places, because that's what we go to in crime fiction. We want to escape to a different place, and it has to be a comforting imaginary place. I mean, I was drawing on obviously a lot of real life experience to create the basics, and obviously lots of different wee villages in Perthshire that would have leapt to mind. But equally, I'd spent a lot of time in Los Angeles back when I was when I worked for Screen International back in the 90s, and I'd been there a lot. Also, it's to recognise that we have a version of Los Angeles in our mind, that entirely derives from the movies and TV that we watch.
And actually, as things unfold, particularly in Perthshire, this idea of anything cosy, as Johnny goes searching and he goes into certain pubs, and then it's very much present day, and kind of, the coziness is removed quite quickly.
But it's that they both kind of infect each other's world, essentially. You know, so Johnny goes to Perthshire but finds different elements of Glencluther or its environs than the ones Penny would find. You know, she's never found anyone offering her cocaine in a pub, you know. and she's never daring to try and stab her in a public toilet, you know, but Johnny somehow finds those things, but he does notice strange stuff like nobody swears. And Penny, equally, when they go to California, there's an influence. Johnny's used to kicking down doors and embracing crack dealers and what have you, and suddenly he realizes he's at lots of cocktail parties and learning that you can get answers by being polite to people rather than grabbing them by the throat. So it's a plays on how the presence of their counterpart starts to affect the world that they're in.
Yeah,
So Penny notices that the type of murder she's investigating has become more squalid than what she's used to. And Johnny notices that everything has become a wee bit more upmarket.
They both have certain sets of rules, if you like, that the other don't really understand to begin with. Swearing being a great idea, a great aspect to that. And you kind of mentioned it a little bit there. I think there's something uncanny through the whole novel, like when Johnny realizes that people aren't swearing and things like that. It's almost like you're catching something out the corner of your eye as a reader, but you can't quite put your finger on it. That there's something not, you know, something shifting going on.
Yeah, it's obviously it's quite delicate in some ways, but Johnny starts to, they're at a wedding, two detectives at a wedding, of course somebody else is going to die, so they find themselves having to investigate, and Johnny comes up with a fairly outlandish theory, not so much a theory, but he notices something about it that he finds really quite unsettling, and Penny's having none of it. She's not going to accept his hypothesis, but and that gave me something to play on all the way through. You know, the Sherlock Holmes thing. You know, if once you've ruled out the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. So I have a bit of fun with that. Although the book does reference Dirk Gently, who used to say that he didn't like to rule out the impossible.
And can we talk a little bit about fonts? Because the title of each chapter in particular, is it just me, or are we supposed to read something into those?
Oh, you definitely are. I mean, the Johnny chapters all have noir type titles, and the Penny chapters have cozy type titles. So when they're at Perthshire, all the wedding, all of Johnny's chapters are called something bloody, something blue, and Penny's are all called Murder by Invitation. And it's the type of title you'd have for a noir type novel versus a cozy type novel. And yeah, but the designers there were very good in coming up with also what seemed like not just the different title fonts to distinguish, but also title fonts that felt appropriate to those different subgenres.
Because there are other, it's not just two, there are other ones as well as the book. Yes. Yeah. And there's a quote at the beginning, the Afghan Whig's Debonair from the album Gentleman, which is a favourite of mine as well. So I immediately kind of picked up on that. Can you talk a little bit about that? And also if music is an inspiration more widely?
Yeah, there's a couple of things I wanted. Ideally, I would have had two sort of epigraphs. And one was actually a song by Jim Eatworld called Place Your Debts. And there's a line in that says, I chose a mystery, went there alone, intentionally. I had to forgive myself for grieving imaginary loss. And it was just about choosing to immerse yourself in a mystery, but also having to deal with your own regrets and live in the moment, because the book's very much about dealing with regret. And all the way through writing the book, this is why I had the quote from Debonair. Every day I was out walking, thinking about what's going on in these characters' lives. The line kept going through my head, this ain't about regret. I could hear Greg Dooley sing, this ain't about regret. Because when he sings that, it's someone in denial. You know, it's someone who is totally singing about their regret. And this is a book about regret. This is about characters who have, well, because it's about story, it's about the stories we tell of ourselves. And it's the question of, well, what if you don't like the story of yourself? What are the implications there for your sense of identity? So because that had gone through my head for years, or all the way through writing it, I thought, like, I've had a correspondence with Greg Dooley going back 20 odd years, and
All
bump into him met him backstage at several shows, and so we've talked a lot, and so I was able to get in touch with him and ask his permission, but I was totally unable to get in touch with anyone from Jimmy Eat World. So my plan of having 2 epigraphs fell flat, but I'm very, very happy and proud to have the Debonair one, because that was the one that chimed all the way through.
Yeah, because as I was reading, I had that in the back of my mind, and I'm thinking, and its meaning changes as you read the book. I think, you know, as you say. And
oh yeah, and the whole thing with tonight I go to hell, yeah.
And you mentioned walking and listening to music. Is that kind of part of the process of thinking?
No, I would never be listening to music when I was walking. I'd be listening to music. That line would be going through my head.
I got you.
Not because when I'm walking, that's how I work. I go out for very long walks and I talk into my phone. Well, I've usually got a wee lapel mic. And I've got a wee app that tries to transcribe it. And then I get back and I'll correct all the garbled transcription and then start building on what I've said while I was walking. So I have to walk in order to be creative. So I clock up a lot of miles. I mean, if I'm in the middle of a book, I can clock up 50, 60 kilometres a week just walking. And I'm often trying to do it, it's usually in the winter. So I tend to look like I'm going deep sea fishing. Wandering around. In fact, when I play it back to myself, there's often this constant sound of pitter-patter of rain on my hood.
You could release those as some kind of a weird edited audiobook version.
That wouldn't make a lot of sense.
And can we talk a little bit about the Ambrose Parry novels, which you just mentioned? That's you and your wife working together. You've said how it's changed kind of the way you work yourself. Was that something that was easy to undertake, and kind of why did you do it in the first place?
God, it wasn't easy to undertake, certainly not. Well, Marisa did a master's in history of medicine. She took some time off work. She needed a break, really, and so she resigned from her job. She was a consultant anaesthetist and did a master's and through that, her dissertation was on the early use of chloroform. And because she was researching that, she found out just this amazing stuff about the early days of chloroform and also the household of James Young Simpson, where it was discovered. And when she told me more and more stories about this, I would say, there's a novel in this, and I can't believe nobody's got there first. So I persuaded her not to go back to work, really. She was thinking of going back, and she was doing a few locum shifts, but she was feeling a wee bit exploited and not very satisfied. And I persuaded her to work with me and write full time on this. And we didn't know what form it would take, this collaboration, whether it would be her researching and sort of pointing me in the right direction, or whether, and we realised that that would never work. It would have to be, she was the one who understood this world, and she had the perspective of a woman in medicine. So she was coming up with the story, really, and I was helping make the plot twisty-turny, really. And we gradually evolved a method of planning it between us and then writing it between us, which has refined over the years. We've got it down to be far more efficient now. We've finished the 5th Ambrose Parry book. We just completed the 2nd draft of that, but the 1st draft, we spent months planning it out so that we could write it in a quite efficient period of time, and I would write parts while she wrote other parts, and then we rewrite each other's, so that it all sounds like the same voice, or at least the 2 voices. There's the voice of Will Raven's point of view and the voice of Sarah Fisher's point of view. And
for yourself, was that to write historical fiction? Did that bring its own challenges?
Of course. It was something I fancied, but I never thought I would have the time in terms of how many years of research I thought it might take to immerse myself in a particular period. So having Marisa, having done all the research, put us in a very different position. So she's the kind of sounding board. She's the one who knows about the world. She can always point us in the right direction. But it was very difficult, things that liberating in some respects, because you don't have to worry about how do you prevent your character phoning the police. You know, it's a big problem in crime fiction nowadays. But you had things to consider, like how dark it is inside. You know, I remember going to the tenement house in Glasgow.
Oh yeah.
And they've got gas lighting in there, and I think that gas lighting dates from maybe as late as the 20s or 30s. And you can see nothing, you know. So you realise that if that was the gas lighting when it was candles and very early gas lighting, that in the winter months it's really dark inside. Nobody would be going outside, especially not a woman in Edinburgh at that point after dark. So, you know, you then realise in order to write this realistically, there's certain things you can't have your character do. And you have to think about what's going on at certain times of day. And the events leading up to and after the discovery of chloroform all happened in November of 1847. So it's, you know, it's dark at 3, 4 o'clock. So that's something I wouldn't normally have to consider as a big factor in the storytelling, but we leaned into it. It's the only thing you can do. But people will notice that all of the books since have taken place in the spring or summer.
That's a lesson learned, no doubt.
Yeah.
And in terms of bringing the two writers, the two parts together, do you do that yourselves before it gets sent to a publisher or an editor?
Oh God, yeah. We rewrite each other's chapters and we'll compile it all into one document, and we'll both go through it. Both go through each other's stuff sometimes before we get to the stage where we're compiling it, and we both go through it and edit it. It's weird because we're both going to open the same document, so you can see some line of dialogue that you were particularly proud of suddenly disappear because your other half decided, nah, that's not working. So by the time we're sending it to an editor, we've been through it a lot. We're both very much on top of it.
I guess, you know, it's one thing to say kill your own darlings, but to kill each other's darlings.
Yeah, you've got to be very tender there.
And I was thinking about your debut, Quite Ugly One Morning, which I think remains one of the most influential crime novels to this day. And that was 97, was that right, when that came out, kind of late 90s?
96.
96.
Came out, yeah.
How do you reflect upon that now, all these many years later?
I'm very proud of the fact that it's still in print, and very surprised by the fact that it's still in print, because at the time it would have probably seemed very of its moment. You know, it was, I sometimes joke about the fact that what's a modern reader going to make of a story about sort of morally bankrupt conservative types trying to sell off the NHS by the back door, you know? So fortunately some things haven't changed. But I think what's interesting to me was obviously my sort of storytelling idiom in the early days was very irreverent and very knockabout. That's just the type of thing I felt comfortable writing, and I became a bit more serious in latter years. But what was great about The Cracked Mirror was that I felt like I was going back to that in terms of writing something that was quite playful. But I couldn't have written The Cracked Mirror 20 odd years ago. You know, it's taken all those years of experience to attempt a novel as complicated as this. And
how do you think Scottish crime fiction has changed over the years since its publication? I mean, it does seem to me that it's become something quite different in terms of its scope and breadth and all of this.
Yeah, I think it's those two things. Mainly it comes down to the fact there's just an awful lot more of it. You know, there's a kind of virtuous circle in that the more Scottish crime fiction there is, the more Scottish crime fiction there will be, because it's become very much our dominant genre and our dominant brand. And as a result, people who are reading and who are perhaps aspiring writers, there's a greater chance if they're Scottish that they're reading a lot of crime, and that's going to influence what type of novel they themselves are inclined to write. And as a result of that, you're going to see more and more of it. And for a small country, we've got, it's not just a question of punching above our weight, it's a question of just how varied our crime fiction is, you know, in terms of whether it's from the cosy end to the hard-boiled end, or the different aspects of Scottish society that it's reflecting. And what I'm hoping to see more of, obviously, is like greater levels or aspects of ethnicity, for instance, that it's reflecting. I think that is still very white, but it is a genre that's open to new perspectives all the time. You know, if someone comes in and they've got a different perspective from what's been seen before, people will gobble it up.
I spoke for another podcast to the shortlisted debut authors for the Bloody Scotland debut prize, and I think that it reflects exactly what you've said. There's a real variety. Some are historic, some are comic in certain ways. You know, there's a real kind of distance in all five of them. And in terms of place as well, I think sometimes you used to think it was a Central Belt thing, and now that's definitely not the case. A question I asked them was if they had any advice to people about getting their debut published, and they were very kind in giving that. But I was wondering if you had advice to people who have been published with a debut, what to do next? What's their kind of next step?
I think really it's about continuing to write what you want to write rather than responding to what you think people liked about your first book. I was very well served by my publishers in that when I got a deal for Quite Ugly One Morning, it was a 2-book deal. And I remember when they said, it was summer of '95, they said, well, we're going to publish this next summer. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I've got to wait a year to see, you know, finally get a publishing deal. I've got to wait a year to see my book. And obviously I didn't realise how many aspects there were to the editing process and the publishing process. But the crucial thing was my second novel was delivered and edited before the first novel was published, which meant there was no pressure. There wasn't that difficult second album thing. And there was, crucially, I wasn't thinking, well, everyone liked Quite Ugly One Morning. What did they like about it? You know, and I might have made mistakes in terms of assuming what they liked about it was the scatological humour, for instance, or, you know, I might have focused on the wrong thing. So I was fortunate in that respect. So I think anyone who's in that position of writing their second novel, if they've not already done it, I think it's just ask yourself what you want to write. You know, what's the thing that excites you about writing and about your own type of writing, rather than think, well, what did the public respond to? That would be, to me, it was something that was taken out of my hands very astutely by my publisher, but I knew what the value of what it was they had done.
And something else I asked was if while they were writing it, they ever thought of people actually reading it, a readership, and they all said, no, not at all. It was all about the writing. But you've been writing for so long. Do you think of a readership when you're writing novels these days?
In terms of our readership, it's hard to define. You know, I wouldn't make any assumptions about who they are.
Right.
I mean, when I was writing Quite Ugly One Morning, I was writing largely for my own amusement, you know, thinking this is something that makes me laugh and I want to see a book like this. And in fact, when we were writing the first Ambrose Parry book, Marisa kept saying, we were writing it because it didn't exist. You know, she said she'd like to have read a really good historical novel about this stuff, and there wasn't one. So if there isn't one, you've got to do it yourself. And she kept saying, if there was one there, she'd be quite happy. She wouldn't feel she needed to write it. But with something like The Cracked Mirror, I was conscious of what readers would make of it. You know, I was conscious that crime fiction readers are very literate in terms of their own genre. And so I didn't want to write something that was in any way lacking in an understanding of that genre. So I knew I had to kind of hold myself to a high standard in that respect. I wanted crime fiction readers to enjoy all of the Easter eggs, all the little knowing references. So in that respect, I was very conscious of who my readers might be.
I think that's absolutely part of the joy of reading it is, you know, different readers will pick up on different things and you know, take what they want from it. And it's been longlisted for this year's McIlvanney Prize, since we're talking about Bloody Scotland. And has the development of that festival and other festivals similarly, has that been something which has been helpful in Scottish crime fiction to create a community, I guess, which it seems to me that there is?
Yeah, I think undoubtedly. I mean, I think the thing that struck me about Bloody Scotland was that it very quickly felt like a sort of part of the landscape. you know, it felt even after a couple of years like it had always been there. And I think people not only look forward to it, they look forward to it as a part of the social calendar, and it allows people to get to know each other, whether that's people in the publishing side of it or the writing side of it, and the readers. I think what's great about Bloody Scotland is it's very informal. You know, readers can be hanging about in the same space as the writers, and the writers are often put in an unusual context, whether that's been singing songs or playing football or taking part in quizzes. And I think it's probably helped cement the sense that Scotland is a leading exponent of crime fiction. You know, I think it was remiss that it didn't have a branded crime fiction festival. So it's probably really helped people feel like Scottish crime fiction is a sort of internationally recognisable quantity.
Yeah, absolutely, in a way which I think is quite rare. And it does seem to me that it's a community that's incredibly welcoming as well to all, which perhaps is rare too. Chris, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me. It's been an absolute pleasure, and all the best with the Cracked Mirror. I don't think you'll need it. I'm sure it'll be a huge success, but it's a terrific novel.
Thank you very much.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.